Hi, everybody. This is Creston Davis from the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and I'm really pleased to be here today talking with Professor Clayton Crockett. Hey, Clayton, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Preston. Thanks.
Where are you in the world today?
I'm in Conway, Arkansas. That's where I live.
You're in Conway, Arkansas. Fantastic. And you're in your home, or is that an office?
I'm at home.
Nice, nice. Conway, Arkansas. Now, didn't they just have some tornadoes blow through there recently?
Yeah, they missed Conway, but they hit Mayflower, which is just south of us, about 6 miles, and Valonia, which is about 12 miles east. So did a lot of destruction. About 14, 15 people were killed. It was terrible.
Wow. Boy, that is extraordinary. I hope you all are doing well and the community's recovering.
Yeah, a lot of people are pitching in to try to do what we can to help out the people that have lost their houses and in some cases loved ones in this.
Wow, that is pretty intense.
Yeah.
How do you deal with those kinds of things as a philosopher, just in general? I mean, is
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, philosophy has always sort of been a refuge from the tragedies of existence and life, the world, suffering, personal, and then social, political, and I guess natural and cosmic, even theological suffering. But then it also gives this kind of source of strength and affirmation as well. And I think that Nietzsche was the first real philosopher that I engaged, that I sort of say I cut my teeth on philosophy with Nietzsche. And once you do that, he breaks you down, and you can't really go back into these kind of analytic, compartmentalized boxes that some professional philosophers try to erect and then defend.
Yeah, that's one thing I really admire and others admire about your work is that you don't hide behind, as you say, the provincial or the propositions, even though you take propositions seriously, but you don't hide behind them in certain privileged spaces. And I think with the natural disaster that just hit your area, really sort of brings that out in terms of philosophy as a life and as a way. And I really admire your work because you don't sort of hedge in in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that human beings are rational animals. I mean, we're animals who have rationality and can be rational at times. It's a tool, but that's not disconnected from other interests, feelings, emotions, passions, all these kinds of things, both positive and negative, that affect and shape how we use our reason, our understanding, and how we make sense of the world and then act in it.
Wow. Well, Clayton, if I could, just to become more familiar or allow others to become more familiar with your own work, can you tell us some highlights of your own, kind of your own arc in terms of development of concepts, ideas, and where have those ideas led you recently?
Okay, so my dissertation was a religious slash theological reading of the Kantian Sublime, and so, but using continental philosophy to do that. And so Kant's theory of the sublime, which is famous in his third critique, and what I did was I developed a reading of the Critique of Pure Reason that read the transcendental imagination in the first critique, and then read the analytic of the sublime in the third critique, the critique of judgment, and I read the third critique back into the first, and I did that using people like Derrida, Deleuze, Heidegger, and Lyotard, and then I made an argument that this was somehow a religious or theological reading, partly using Tillich, and it was also sort of positioned sort of over against the theology of radical orthodoxy, which was really coming to the fore in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so that ended up being my first book, Theology of the Sublime. And then from there, from
And that was,
Kant,
sorry, Clayton, that was published.
yeah,
That was published with Routledge. Is that right?
yeah, yeah, 2001.
Okay.
And so then from Kant, I took some of those same issues and interests, the idea of the sublime, and I shifted from Kant to Freud, and so I started doing all this reading of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory, and so from Freud to also Lacan, Julia Kristeva, Lucia Irigaray, Slavoj Žižek, and wrote my second book, which was called Interstices of the Sublime: Theology and Psychoanalytic Theory, which came out with Fordham in 2007, which was really trying to work through what are some of the points of contact, of intersection between theology and psychoanalysis, with continental philosophy serving as kind of the third or the mediator between those two. And Slavoj Žižek was kind enough to give me a blurb for that, which was really exciting, and Žižek's work was just being really taken up and read in just unbelievable global world transformative ways at that time, as you know. And then partly through my interest in psychoanalysis and contemporary readings of Lacan, but also what was going on in the world with the election of George W. Bush, the re-election of George W. Bush, the events of September 11, 2001, the global war on terror, the war against Afghanistan, Iraq, and really struggling with what was going on politically as well as economically, socially, in terms of what's sometimes called the return of religion. I got interested more in sort of what we could call political theology, and so this has a continental tradition in history that goes back to Carl Schmitt, right, in his famous political theology 4 chapters on the notion of sovereignty, where he says that all of our modern political concepts are secularized theological concepts. And this is a famous and controversial assertion. Schmitt, of course, a famous and controversial writer who's had lots of influence on later continental philosophers, including Derrida and Agamben, not just to say a couple. And then crossing that with some of my background in radical theology, this notion of the death of God theology, in terms of what that means, partly in relation to my collaboration and friendship with Jeff Robbins, who wrote a great essay on terror and the postmodern condition for an edited book I did with the University of Virginia Press. We sort of identified a weakness or a lapse in what was then postmodern theology, in that it was insufficiently political or politicized, and we tried to politicize some of that discourse with death of God theology, postmodern theology, and then also this kind of continental philosophy of religion that emerged around John D. Caputo's work and others like Merrill Westphal and Richard Carney. And so I developed this radical political theology, which was my 3rd book, published by Columbia University Press in 2011. And at the same time, Jeff Robbins was working on some of these same ideas, and his book came out also in 2011, which was called Radical Democracy and Political Theology.
Wow. So your arc goes from Kant sublime to the psychoanalytic, and then on to political theology. And what seems to be really at the fore of your work is the idea of the intellectual being responsible or being able to respond well to material conditions of the world, of politics, of basic structures that make life worth living.
Absolutely. And the idea of a theological materialism, there's a discourse stemming out of the work of Gilles Deleuze, who I got more interested in, called the new materialism. And so some feminists, Delanda, some Whiteheadian philosophers, other Rosie Braidotti, William Connolly, Jane Bennett at Johns Hopkins, this notion of a new materialism, often related to Deleuze, sometimes Merleau-Ponty, but sort of thinking about what it would mean to have a genuine theological materialism that wouldn't just sort of appropriate materialism or put it into some kind of transcendent otherworldly realm. And then so Jeff and I ended up collaborating on a book called Religion, Politics, and the Earth, and then the subtitle was The New Materialism. It came out in 2012, and then I ended up publishing a book last year, 2013, on called Deleuze Beyond Badiou, and sort of taking Badiou's polemic against Deleuze, right, Gilles Deleuze, the claimer of being, and his argument that Deleuze is a philosopher of the one, and really sort of critiquing that, but also more importantly using that to open up a space for me to sort of reread Deleuze and suggest that he is a really powerful and important and valuable political thinker and philosopher and theorist. and that really shows up in his cinema books, especially Cinema 2, The Time Image.
Yeah, because I think Deleuze oftentimes gets the rap that he was not a real political thinker until Guattari comes along. But you're sort of harvesting out of his concepts, both potentially with Guattari as well as Deleuze's own corpus. But you're teasing out some of the very political, radical concepts that are applied to the world, something like this.
Yeah, and I think Deleuze was always politically sensitive, interested, engaged, involved. I think he got unfairly attacked by someone like Badiou, but it wasn't, the political ideas weren't explicit in some of his early works, like Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense, and then they come to the fore in the project that he does with Guattari, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. But then the standard sort of reading, right, is that after that, after 1,000 Plateaus, which is this brilliant, experimental, crazy, radical work, he kind of retreats into a kind of austere, quietist isolation, and he detaches or disengages from political issues and ideas. And there's a certain retreat, and I think lots of people were kind of, retreating under the force of what was happening in the world, and the disappointments and frustrations of the establishment of neoliberalism, Reagan, Thatcher, right? The fact that the insurrectionary events of 1968, especially in France and Paris and other places around the world, Mexico, the United States, Central, South America, that these weren't sort of leading to a kind of global transformation of revolution, of communism, and that there was a real problem here. And it's to Badiou's credit that he never sort of gave up or gave in to this kind of capitalism and neoliberalism. But I think what Deleuze was doing was he was really trying to sort of go under and try to really deeply think through what would it mean to seriously think politics under these conditions in the 1980s. And I think that first he looks for in painting. He's studying this great English painter Francis Bacon, and he writes a book called The Logic of Sensation, or subtitle Logic of Sensation, on Bacon's work. And I think that he doesn't quite find what he wants, even though he finds something really interesting. And then he moves into cinema, and it's in the cinema books that he really finds this political concept that is, at least for him, potentially powerful and even explosive, if not revolutionary, which is the time image. And I don't think that has been fully appreciated or understood. I think that a lot of the work on Deleuze with cinema has been, I mean, obviously it's a book about cinema, it's influence affected cinema studies, film studies to a great extent, and then there's people that really see this as a really powerful and important work on philosophy. But I don't think, with the exception of Paolo Moratti at Johns Hopkins, who wrote a great book on Deleuze philosophy and cinema, that there have been many people that have seen this as a deeply political work, and that it's where Deleuze works out his answer to this political problem of what happens with the impasse of where this kind of notion of revolutionary desire and desiring machines and deterritorialization and the sort of the wall that it hits and runs into at the end of 1,000 Plateaus, with the apparatus of capture and the state sort of reappropriating, capitalism always being able to sort of appropriate anything that one moves against it. It's like in Anti-Oedipus, they thought if we could just speed it up, maybe the whole thing would break down.
Right.
And it didn't work. It actually worked better. And so then I see Deleuze. I mean, there's a kind of a solitude there that he gets into the space, but it's a desperate attempt, and I think a really powerful one, to try to identify the political conditions of our contemporary existence through film and cinema, also the technical and aesthetic conditions, but in order to come to a real constructive notion of a time image that he articulates via the brain. And then you see some of Catherine Malibu's work coming out of this with neuroplasticity and even the political connotations and aspects of that, which I think are really important. And so I wanted to draw that out. And even though Badiou sort of becomes a foil, and I kind of caricature him a little bit, and I feel badly about that. But at the same time, his reading of Deleuze, I think, is a caricature. But it becomes a space. It becomes a kind of forcing, right? That forcing Deleuze beyond Badiou's reading and distortion opens up, at least for me, a new vision of Deleuze, which I'm very excited about.
So what you're saying is that Badiou's idea of Deleuze, a caricature as it is, as you say, still nonetheless produces some possibilities that weren't maybe there had Badiou not written that text.
Right. It forces a new reading of Deleuze. It forces so many readers, I mean, I think positive and negative,
right,
of Deleuze and Guattari to respond, to take account, to think through, to work through, what's at stake here. First, is it right or wrong? That's one question, exegetically or personally or whatever, and I think it's wrong. But then the more important issue is, well, what can be done, if anything, with these concepts and with these ideas, right? And then, whether there's lots of events with Deleuze and Guattari, or few events with Badiou, what's the nature of an event? What's the possibilities of an event? How do we come to terms with that? How do we think in a serious and meaningful way?
So again, this gets back to, I think, one of the key issues about your own work is that you see philosophy and the concepts found within philosophy with one who takes philosophy seriously. To quote Deleuze, that philosophy is about inventing concepts or something of this sort in Qu'est-ce que c'est philosophie? But you see philosophy as a means to applying it to certain environments in order to what's the end result of applying philosophical concepts to the world, in your opinion? What do you think?
Well, I think that very distinction or separation, in a sense, deconstructs, right? That you have philosophy over here and the world over here.
Okay, good.
That's one answer, which is partial and insufficient, right? Because in a sense, philosophy is the world, and this is what Francois Laruelle argues, which is what's so problematic. And so we have to almost subtract from that, right? That sufficiency of philosophy, the sufficiency of thinking the world, in order to actually do anything.
Wow.
I do agree with Deleuze that we think under conditions not of our choosing. This is part of what it means to affirm a kind of materialism, that we exist as embodied beings with lines of force, lines of meaning, lines of communication, and really energies. And this is where I've sort of gravitated towards, is this concept of energy, which, of course, you don't create or invent concepts out of nothing, but you sort of take concepts that are already there, that have a history, and you enter into that history in certain selective and practical ways, and then you try and see if you can reinvent these concepts and redeploy these concepts. And the reinvention and the redeployment are part and parcel of the same process, I think. And that's the liberating, possibility of ideas or concepts, if there is any. But just for me, this notion of energy as opening up both a kind of material history of the world, including our recent history and our current conditions with energy scarcity, with the limits of fossil fuel exploitation and consumption, the production or creation of global warming and the effects that those are having on our environment, the extinction of many species in our world, and just connecting that up, this concept of energy and the exploitation of cheap energy, which creates a material civilization, incredible materialization that we benefit from. There would not be, without oil, right? Without this incredible power that you have stored in these organic, right, decayed organic forms, right? You would not have computers. You would not have automobiles. You would not have airplanes. We would not be able to interact virtually in this way, right? Shrink the world. And yet, ironically, because we're using this up, not completely up in the sense that it's going to go away, but in the sense of the ability to maintain a certain extraction and exploitation rate relative to the population and the needs, right? The growth of a capitalist economy that depends on growth, it's unsustainable. We know that, and yet and this is saying capitalism as a religion or as a faith, we know that we can't grow indefinitely,
right?
And yet we act as if we still can,
right?
And it's what do we do when we confront that and come to terms with that? What happens? And so we're forced to back on ourselves to create, to invent, not out of just kind of wishful thinking or fantasy, not out of some of these, apocalyptic scenarios which are pervading our culture, right? But to genuinely and desperately recreate, reimagine, reinvent the world, which is what you're doing with education through GCAS, right? How do you create something new? You're not starting out of nothing, right? You're not inventing education, but you're reinventing education. Yeah. And you're experimenting with different ways to do education, putting together people, putting together ideas, putting together objects, machines, right? And
sure.
Seeing what we can generate together.
And having fun while we're doing it, which is really brilliant.
Well, that's the thing, too. That's a Spinoza's joy, right? We always need to maintain the sense of joy and wonder and sense that, we are desiring and passionate beings at the same time as we're doing this. It's so crucial.
Well, speaking of, could you briefly, as we wind down here, and thank you so much for that. It's really brilliant it's just really nice to hear you talk through concepts and how you work through in your own way, ideas from Deleuze to Spinoza even from energy and all the basic things that make up life. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the class that you're taking, which a lot of students are interested, have already signed up for your class that you're teaching on Deleuze. Would you mind speaking about that?
Well, I really feel, and I came to understand after multiple readings and even teaching this as like an independent study to upper level undergraduate students and philosophy and religious studies majors, that Difference and Repetition is a text that has not been thoroughly understood. It has not been thoroughly grappled with. And I struggled to understand it. It took me multiple times. I still don't fully understand it. But the key to my rereading of Deleuze was a rereading and a re-understanding of Difference and Repetition. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's reasons why I think everyone who studies Deleuze understands that it's his magnum opus, and yet at the same time, it's been so difficult to read and comprehend because there's so much going on. He goes through the whole history of philosophy up to that point, but he's also bringing in mathematics, he's bringing in aesthetics, he's bringing in psychoanalysis, he's bringing in physics. I mean, there's all this stuff. It's so dense, it's so rich, it's so packed. And furthermore, it was untranslatable and was not translated into English until 1994 by Paul Patton. And so you have this gap, right, published in 1968 in French, and then not translated into English until 1994.
Right.
And so people who are reading Deleuze are reading, for the most part, either Deleuze on somebody else, right, Deleuze on Nietzsche, Deleuze on Spinoza, Deleuze on Bergson, which is great, but that's also a composite, right?
Yeah.
And then, or you're reading the Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the Anti-Oedipus, which again is brilliant, it's great, it's profound, it's extraordinary, but it becomes such a fad and such a slogan that it's hard to figure out, what's really going on, what's really at stake there. Sure. And so to get a handle on what Deleuze is about, and I would say a kind of ontology, right? I think you have to start with Difference and Repetition.
And so your class is going to be you're going to be directing students to reading through Difference and Repetition or certain sections. How's that work?
I want them to read I want us to read it all over the course of 4 weeks.
So we really should be
encouraging to
start getting into it already. Yes.
What's that?
We should start to encourage students signed up, or what we call researchers, to start reading it if they haven't already.
If they want to get started, yeah, absolutely, that would be fantastic. But we'll work through it as carefully as we can, given the time constraints.
Yeah.
And I want to have Dan Barber come and visit us. He's the author of a great new book called Deleuze and the Naming of God, The Politics of Immanence. And so he's going to make a sort of a guest appearance and sort of teach us, help us understand what does immanence mean in Deleuze's work, how does it function, what are the political consequences and connotations of that. But really, just to sort of work through and think through, even if it's just like an initial, undertaking, to try to come to terms with what's going on and what's at stake in difference and repetition, because I think it's like a critique of pure reason. It's like the phenomenology of spirit. It's like being in time. It's like a grammatology. It's one of these books that changes the whole history of philosophy, and yet, like Nietzsche says, we haven't gotten there yet. We still don't understand what's been done with that. I mean, that's why Foucault made that. I mean, and he was joking, right? But he said perhaps one day the century will be known as Deleuzian. And he's kind of, he's kind of kidding, right? But at the same time, to the extent that there's something there, he's relying on what is it that Deleuze has done in difference and repetition. How does that ontology inform, as Foucault said, so much of what Foucault was doing with his history of sexuality, his archaeology, his genealogy, all this stuff. Is fundamentally Deleuzian, and I think that we do an injustice to ourselves and to Deleuze if it just becomes a kind of hermetically sealed work, right, where you have these kind of Deleuzians or Deleuze-Guattarians talking just amongst themselves, and it's almost impossible to figure out, what's going on from outside of that. We need to open that up, and we really need to.
Perhaps maybe in this way, the judging of a text shouldn't be judged in terms of how it's been interpreted heretofore, but rather how a corpus of people can continue engaging and returning and get more life out of the text. It keeps giving forth ideas and concepts.
Yeah, how we can and what we can do with it. And Deleuze always said, it's less important what something is than what it can do. So we're going to try to see what difference and repetition can do.
Fantastic, Clayton. Well, it's really been a pleasure to talk with you this afternoon, and really appreciate your involvement with GCAS and your involvement with philosophy and editing a book series with you. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you so much for your time.
Likewise, Kristen. Just love working with you and totally support this, and really appreciate talking to you. So
yeah, it's a pleasure. And so those of you who are interested in taking part in Clayton's class, you can feel free to email me at creston@globaladvancedstudies.org, or you could email me at creston.davis@gmail.com, or potentially even Facebook, Clayton, Crockett, or me. So get in touch with us. We're really wanting to build a community of readers, a community of folks who want to create concepts and create them in different ways, and in order to apply them to problems in our world and to overcome certain obstacles, as Clayton was saying. So thank you so much, Clayton. It's a real pleasure. Say hi to Vicky for me, and have a great day.
Will do. You too. Bye, Chris.
Thanks, Clayton. Bye.